Good morning. As John mentioned, the genesis or the inspiration for our Advent lecture series does indeed require documentation or attribution. As John mentioned, Carolyn, parishioner, recommended to Father Brewer, who then recommended to Dr. Stotts, who then recommended to me, that we enter into this text for our Advent series. And I'm very grateful to be introduced into the canon of Claire Keegan. And as I mentioned to some of you prior to the beginning of the session, that one of my projects for the winter break, after finishing grading all the papers, is to explore her canon in greater detail. This novella is the shortest work of literature ever to make the short list for the 2022 Booker Prize, which is awarded for the best novel written in English and published in the United Kingdom or in Ireland. And I have this practice at the Divinity School, Margaret will attest to this, that I usually begin each class with a reading and a work of art. And if you're reading from this particular edition of the novel, you have before you the actual cover for this particular edition. It is titled Hunters in the Snow, Winter by Peter Bruegel. And when I began studying the novel and conducting the research for today's presentation, I began with the image on the cover to see perhaps why this was chosen to represent the novella. And as you observe the painting by Bruegel, it's a representation of a world that is locked in winter, nevertheless teeming with life. And the viewer's attention is immediately arrested by the wheeling crow in the sky. This is a genre scene. It's an image of daily life, and the novel by Keegan is indeed representative of the daily life of those who live in New Ross. The branches of the three trees in the foreground, the branches fan outwardly like black capillaries. And crows keep watch over the scene. What we infer is that it's been a rather unsuccessful hunt because each of the hunters has his head cast downward, as if in this posture that is reminiscent of defeat. Even the dogs appear rather downtrodden. One hunter carries a small fox. The trail of rabbit tracks suggest that more of the hunted have recently escaped the hunters, but there are others who are enjoying the day, particularly the skaters. There is such intelligence on the part of the editors in choosing this representation for covering the book, in that what Bruegel has done is, in a way, what Keegan as writer has done. Bruegel has replicated a world on a scale that is both large and small, and has mirrored the human condition, continuously locked to life's day-to-day activities, the small things, the familiar, the ordinary, continuously locked to life's day-to-day activities, yet striving to see the world in its glory in an instant. This depiction of a cold, overcast day, it is masterfully orchestrated. It's a panoramic view of the world. And what I find most interesting is the geometry of this painting. Sloping diagonals on the left. The roofs and the ground lead our eyes into the scene. And the rhythm of the diagonal is countered by this succession of horizontal elements, bridges and land. The diagonals of the hills, the mountains on the right. We're taken into this geometry of diagonal and horizontals. And we experience the scene from up on high, a perspective comparable to the perspective of the crows in the foreground trees' branches. Human activity in this expansive view, analogous to a map. What I think is also very brilliant in this particular image is how the viewer's eyes is taken immediately to the flight of the crow, which is one of the most, I think, incredible scenes that Keegan draws in the novel, because in December there is this unusual number of crows that descend upon New Ross. Do you know what a gathering of crows is referred to as? Murder. A murder of crows, exactly. And it adds very much to the rather ominous atmosphere that she draws as part of the setting for her story. So with that introduction of Bruegel, the title that I've given to today's lecture is The Gravity of the Understated and the Literary State of Grace. And my research and writing of the lecture has been guided by these three epigraphs. Epigraph 1, my silences had not protected me. Your silences will not protect you. Audre Lorde, from her essay, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. Epigraph 2, the dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/9 of the iceberg being above the water. Ernest Hemingway. Epigraph 3, the hardest thing in the world is simplicity. James Baldwin. In 110 deceptively effortless pages of prose, Claire Keegan addresses the national scandal of the Magdalene laundries and narrates the scandal so quietly that we as readers find ourselves breathless. She has composed a story of hope and quiet heroism that is a triumph of compassion and a stern indictment of the transgressions committed and justified in the name of religion. In the novella, Small Things Like These, the narrative power emanating from the hands of the literary artist lies in Keegan's masterful employment of the narrative strategy, the understatement. The heft of the narrative is the seeming weightlessness. However, the gravity of the understated becomes palpable. It is the understated quietness of the telling that renders the cruelty so stark. When we enter this text, we enter an exploration of the silent, self-interested complicity of a whole community. The book is not so much about the nature of evil, but the circumstances that allow evil, circumstances of which humans are the architects. The book explores the silent, self-interested complicity of a whole community, which makes it possible for such cruelty to persist. I am reminded when Elie Wiesel spoke at Vanderbilt for the last time, the one quotation that became indelibly inscribed upon me was when he argued that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. And the indifference, the silenced indifference of those in New Ross that enable this cruelty to persist. This book demands of every reader to examine one's conscience and to ask oneself, what am I doing about the injustices I encounter in my daily life? Or do I elect not to direct my attention and take a vow of self-imposed silence? Astonishingly, Keegan achieves this effect without abandoning her artistic restraint and descending into sentimentality or didacticism. As a writer, Keegan assumes and maintains a narratorial posture that is not overtly condemnatory of a character. For example, consider the behavior of the Mother Superior. Her position is reinforced by the nuns who remain obedient in spite of the circumstances they know, circumstances to which they are complicit, but her position is also reinforced by those representatives of the institutional church who have invested the Mother Superior with her authority. Keegan does not damn her. She does not consider such judgment to be within the province of her narratorial position. Keegan remarks that if she were to have written the novel from the perspective of the Mother Superior, that she would endeavor to show the reasons why the woman has become the person she is through the implication of attribution to motive. Nor is the story of young Sarah the focus, she who is discovered shivering in the coal shed alone. Sarah is the composite of the women and girls who were made peripheral figures by their parents, by their families, and by a very impoverished, violent theology. In an interview Keegan granted upon being nominated for the Booker Prize, she stated that when she initially conceived of writing the story, she imagined writing from the perspective of a boy who accompanies his father to deliver a load of coal and finds another boy, much his own age, locked up in the coal shed at a boarding school. His father just locks the door and goes to make the next delivery while remaining silent. But at an interval in her writing, the Coleman's perspective assumed primacy, and Keegan becomes preoccupied with his character and decides that it becomes necessary for her as a writer to explore how he, the father, would carry this knowledge around with him on his rounds, through his days, through his life, or how he could or would still regard himself as a good father. I quote, "I think the laundry scandal overshadows the community in which Bill Furlong lives. It's his atmosphere, it's the environment, but I don't think that it's the story at all. I think this is a story of a man with 5 daughters in a marriage who is running a coal yard and is probably a workaholic and maybe facing a midlife crisis. I think it's a story about a man who was loved in his youth and can't resist offering the same love to somebody else. And it may be a self-destructive thing. I think this is a love story. It's not a romantic love story, but it's a story about love," unquote. At the end of the narrative, the question that announces itself is, will Bill Furlong be able to regard himself as a good father, given that his actions may result in his having deprived his daughters of a decent education, and that he may lose his business, and that he may not be able to provide for his family? What Keegan does most brilliantly as a literary artist is to write the narrative and to take us as readers into the subjunctive mood, the conditional mood. And as Keegan contends, and I quote, "I'm interested in how we cope, how we carry what's locked in our hearts. I wasn't deliberately setting out to write about misogyny or Catholic Ireland or economic hardship or fatherhood or anything universal. But I did want to answer back the question of why so many people said or did little or nothing, knowing that girls and women were incarcerated and forced to labor in these institutions. It caused so much pain and heartbreak for so many. Surely this wasn't necessary or natural," unquote. It is it not, the ordinariness of the community she incarnates in this representation of the community of New Ross that makes the community's complicity all the more nefarious and pernicious. Her craft as a literary artist lies in the precision of what I would describe as a painterly prose. She makes each detail count. No syllable deprives the preceding syllable or subsequent syllable of the oxygen whereby each detail cannot pulsate on the page. For example, when preparing the cake mixture for the Christmas cake, Bill creams the butter and the sugar. The daughters grate the lemon rind, chop candied peel, and pick stalks out of the dried fruit, while Eileen sifts the flour and spice. As readers, we find ourselves, do we not, leaning into the rhythm, the cadence of a marriage bound less by passion than by a shared domestic ritual in the managing of a house and the rearing of a family. Keegan has captured the contentment, but also the undercurrents, the undertow that threaten the contentment and the emotional gap that is beginning to open between Bill and Eileen. This undertow is the silenced force that is in opposition to what is apparent. We read this scene of the making of the Christmas cake, and perhaps we're inclined to quote Robert Browning that God's in heaven and all's right with the world. But we also, as readers, know that there is what I described as this silenced force, this undertow that is pulling very tenaciously at what seems to be apparent. All the details are pared back, and I realize I just ended in a preposition for which I would criticize my students vehemently. There is no tension between Bill's mother and her employer over their religious beliefs. All is understated. The religious beliefs of Mrs. Wilson and of Bill and his mother, both sides are described as being lukewarm. We never, as readers, bear witness to the nuns physically abusing the girls. In the tradition of the Greek theater, the violence, the abuse, is occurred off stage. We see the effects, but we never bear witness to the act itself. What we see, however, are the nuns fawning over a girl who has been undeniably abused while they flaunt their power to exclude Bill's daughters from their education. It is, I would argue, one of the literary tour de forces in the entire novel. Imagine that scene where Bill discovers young Sarah having been placed outside with her bare feet in the coal shed, and he takes her to the door of the convent. And imagine this theatrically. It's a study in improvisation, but at the same time resuming control. When the door is opened and Bill and the young girl are seen, the door is closed. Because this is not a part of the script. And then the door is opened and they enter. And it's under the guise of hospitality, under this guise of manners, the taking of tea, that the Mother Superior is able to regain her control over the entire setting. It is a masterfully written theatrical scene. The young girl is invited to become dressed, return to the room to take tea with the Mother Superior and Bill. And the script resumes under this, what I would describe as this very scripted way to preserve this perverse equilibrium in the convent. And there's one moment when Bill, who would be the interloper in the equilibrium, begins to ask of Sarah a question, but before Sarah can answer, the nun that is preparing the food coughs, which becomes the signifier for Sarah not to speak. It is a masterfully written scene. I think it's also one, as I said, of the tour de forces scenes in the entire novel, because it really suggests the control which the Mother Superior has. At the same time, there is the offering of hospitality and the fawning over Sarah, who is sitting there, and her breasts are leaking because she has not been able to nurse her child. And under the guise of good manners and hospitality, at the same time, there is this reminder that Bill's children go to St. Margaret's School, which is the best school for Catholic children, and how that perhaps could be deprived of them. It's a study in horror, is it not? It is horrific in its own way. So I think the way that Margaret, the way that that's written, it's written by Keegan with such masterful control of her craft, but at the same time it mirrors the control and how easily it is to restore this equilibrium under the guise of manners. Even the heroism, when it does come in the end, is written in a rather tender, low key, rather than this grand, heroic gesture. And so as readers, what we are left with in the final movement is less of this searing indictment of national outrage. More so, we are left with an affirmation of human decency. Small things like these assures us that we are all capable of exercising our free will to do the right act, and that human goodness, like misery, can be transmitted from human to human, generational. But as a storyteller, what Keegan shows, and that is the role of the author, to show, not to explain, not to interpret for us, but to show. And what she shows us is that a righteous person does what is righteous and does not ask the question, will this act help me and advance my favor? Or can this act displace me? In writing and showing this question, Keegan takes us as readers into what might be described as the literary state of grace. This novella is dedicated to the women and children who suffered in Ireland's Magdalene laundries, the horrific asylums administered by the Roman Catholic institutions for most of the 20th century, ostensibly to reform fallen young women. But the keen gaze of this wonderfully distilled, crystallized narrative does not focus solely on the victims of this institutionalized cruelty or the nuns who imprisoned the women within high walls topped with broken glass that even can be seen in the snowfall. Instead, the focus is upon Bill Furlong and his harrowing quest for meaning in a setting in which this unconscionable practice is permitted. From 1922 to as recently as 1996, thousands of girls and women were held prisoner in the Magdalene laundries in Ireland. These workhouses were commercial and profit-based laundries run and funded by the Catholic Church in collusion with the state. The true figure of those held remains unknown. It is thought that it was at least 10,000. Others contend that the real figure may be as high as 30,000 if you go back into the 19th century when the practice was also known. But the records of the laundries were deliberately destroyed, lost, or made inaccessible by the church. While there, the women were forced to labor tirelessly, suffering physical and mental abuse at the hands of the church. The women and girls who were unwillingly held were often described as fallen women. They tended to be unmarried mothers and their daughters, those who had grown up in the church or state care, women with mental health issues or disabilities, and those who had suffered from sexual abuse. Confined for decades, starved of food, of education, many became isolated from society and were later institutionalized. Many lost their lives, as did their children. It was in the early 90s that 155 unmarked graves were discovered on the land of a convent in Dublin, which eventually triggered a public scandal and a wider awareness of the laundries. In 1994, folk singer Joni Mitchell wrote a song titled "The Magdalene Laundries," which is included on her album Turbulent Indigo. In 2002, The Magdalene Sisters was released in cinemas, a depiction of 4 women incarcerated in a Dublin laundry. In 2013, we saw the release of the film Philomena, about a woman desperately trying to find her forcefully adopted son after life in a laundry. Stories of the laundries persist in media and the arts, with many books, plays, screen adaptations of the women's stories. And the last Magdalene laundry stopped operating on the 25th of October, 1996. But no apology by the Irish government was issued until as recently as 2013, less than a decade. As readers, we meet the protagonist of the story, Bill Furlong, whose moral code has been smelted at the foundry of Mrs. Wilson's compassion. Whereas his livelihood involves the smelting of coal, the greater refining, the greater smelting in his life occurs at the hands of a woman, Mrs. Wilson. Like the Catholic parish that presides as this monolith over the town of New Ross in 1985, Ireland, Bill's social background reflects both salvation and oppression. But his character, as we are allowed to see the character, the actual formation of his moral character, occurs not by the catechism, occurs not by religious instruction. It occurs at the hands of a woman, a Protestant, a widow, who refuses to reduce him to an abstraction or to an adjective, and to allow the term illegitimate to define him. When his unmarried teenage mother, a live-in Catholic domestic to a Protestant widow, becomes with child, she is dismissed by her family. However, her employer, by an act of will, elects to retain her. And I think that election of her will, that would be, I think, an example, would it not, of indeed a righteous person and a righteous act. It's a very bold act of resistance. but yet she has the economic means whereby she can provide for one who has been dismissed by one's own family. She elects to retain Bill's mother in her employment, and the infant child sleeps in a Moses basket while his mother fulfills her domestic duties. And Mrs. Wilson continues to provide for Bill after his mother dies when he is only 12 years old. The young Bill is nurtured by his mentor's generosity and by her rather progressive ideas. But he is also cognizant, once he steps outside of Mrs. Wilson's home, he is always cognizant of his illegitimate status that is pronounced by the town's inhabitants. The scene where he comes home and the others have spit upon his coat. But Bill is like a Dickensian hero. He gains social acceptance as a hard-working coal merchant. He marries Eileen, a woman from a middle-class family. He becomes a doting father to 5 smart, lovely daughters. But the respectability Bill has worked so hard to maintain, namely, as the narrator says, and I quote, to keep his head down and stay on the right side of people. This will ensure his daughter's success at St. Margaret's School, which is the only good Catholic school in New Ross. But keeping his head down, having to stay on the right side of people, suggests, does it not so much a life, but an existence of performing. And as we meet Bill, who has worked so hard to maintain this position, we also see that he is on the brink of falling into an existential quandary. He's never allowed to forget that in spite of his success, he is the perpetual outsider. He senses danger in rituals that others take for granted. He aches for his youngest daughter, Loretta, when she becomes frightened by the Santa Claus, who is like the Pied Piper luring a horde of children toward a cave of shiny presents during the town's holiday parade. That rather heartwarming tableau of his wife and daughters making mince pies for Christmas makes Bill wonder, nevertheless, in spite of this contentment, if the predictable grind of providing for his family is all there is in life. We're taken into the interiority of a man who begins to question as he observes the small things like these, the way that his daughters genuflect when they enter the sanctuary, his daughter taking her place in the choir, the making of the Christmas cake and the mince pies. He begins to wonder if all that is so predictable according to his commitments at the coal yard or all the rituals associated with the liturgical season, is this really all there is in life? And this vice-like rhythm of daily life is beginning to suffocate his spirit. But at the same time that he begins to question this, and as I said, is on the brink of this existential quandary, he also wonders about the deep loss he would experience if this stability were to be renounced. So we meet Bill as one who is seeking this meaningful transformation while knowing full well that his action could ostracize not just him, but his entire family. That's the power that the monolithic institution asserts upon Bill. If he does act righteously, the effects would not be not just for him, but upon his family as well. Not only would he be displaced, his family also would suffer the consequences of displacement by the righteous actions of their father. His antagonist, and it is indeed rather ironic, is it not, that the convent is named the Good Shepherd Convent. The convent represents not the spiritual realm. It's more representative of the world. An institution, the convent and the church in collusion with the state for profit at the expense of indentured servitude. This institution claims to uphold love, faith, and charity. The capitalist operation of the town's laundry business, in collusion with the Irish government, to exploit and to abuse the downtrodden women, it reveals to us, does it not? It shows to us, does it not, this egregious betrayal of the tenets of Christianity. Time and timelessness are this novella's DNA strands. Bill's struggle is timeless in evoking the fragility of civil society before a very oppressive system. Ominous signs, such as a December murder of crows, scavenging for what is dead, or diving in mischief for anything that looked edible, as the narrator says. You have the ominous presence of the murder of crows, scavenging the streets, and then you have juxtaposed very acutely against that scene the ripening fruits from a secluded garden. And then you have this Cinderella trope of orphaned girls deprived of walking shoes and mistreated by their ugly stepsisters, the nuns, which gives, does it not, Maureen, the novella a rather fairy tale quality. Now, there are tropes that Keegan has embedded within this narrative. But at the same time, this culturally specific milieu of the 1980s Ireland heightens the potentially tragic consequences of Bill's action. To her credit, as an artist and as a literary theologian, Keegan has written most exquisitely this ambiguous finale that it shows the narratives about at-risk young women are not confined by fiction, nor are they confined by time. It's uncertain how Bill's act of courage will affect his daughters, whose well-being has inspired his wish for a radical change in the first place over time. But the gaps between Bill's fictional 1985 act of resistance and the closing of the Magdalene laundries in 1996 and the Irish government's belated apology to the victims in 2013 illustrate or show that justice, sadly, takes decades to arrive. Bill makes a giant leap from a succession of measured steps, from this idea of seemingly insignificant gestures, the small things, when added up, become exponential. They amount to life. And these small steps that we witness Bill taking aligns beautifully with the meaning of his last name, furlong, which means furrow length. It's the distance, 1/8 of a mile, that a team of oxen could plow without having to rest. And those are my thoughts. I have no idea what time it might be.
We have about 10 minutes.
Oh, since we're going to be entering in this novella for 3 weeks, next week I would like to discuss in great detail, to really conduct what might be considered an exegesis of the actual representation of the Mass that is written by Keegan. But at this time, given that we do have a few more minutes, I'm anxious to hear your questions or your perceptions about whatever ideas I presented in the lecture, or questions you might have as well from your own engagement.
A quick show of hands, those of you who have actually read this so far. Good. Just getting an indication. Good. I do have one copy. You can owe me $15. See you afterwards.
Yeah. Your hand was first, and then you, sir. Yes.
No spoilers, I hope, but I thought it was really interesting the way he has purchased those wonderful patent shoes for his wife, and he's going to give those to her when she opens that door.
I know.
This little girl who has no shoes.
In her bare feet. Yeah.
Yeah, that was
Yeah. It is an incredibly acute juxtaposition that Bill has observed Eileen looking at the window with the shoes, and makes the decision then that will be her present, and we infer that is going to be somewhat of a sacrifice in their budget, but it's an act of love that he does for Eileen. But you're right, that acute juxtaposition of this fine accessory next to a young girl in her bare feet, having traversed the streets of New Ross as the snow falls. And I think that what's important there, I would argue, is that it's just that. It's the acute juxtaposition. It's one of the ways I think that Keegan, as a writer, in maintaining the narratorial posture that she does, is to show this contradiction, to show this juxtaposition, and not buying the child's shoes or trying to find her a pair of shoes upon a moment of arrival. Because I think what is so very much at play here on her part as a writer is to avoid what I think is the cardinal transgression in writing, is to descend into sentimentality and then to descend into didacticism and have to write a moral. I think it is the actual starkness of the juxtaposition and how relentless these juxtapositions pervade and remain throughout the entire novel that she maintains that to the very end. As I said earlier, I think she writes us into the subjunctive because Bill is in this particular state whereby he has to question, if I take further action, what are the implications? So taking us into that subjunctive, not thinking that it's a part of her province as a writer to tell us the next day. I mean, the incredible restraint in her craft, I think. And I think, in reference to your question, the fact that you and I as readers, we see this contradiction. We see this juxtaposition. That's our province as readers. And what the effect of it is, the fact that she doesn't interpret it or explain it or impose upon it some nice sense of closure, whatever that means, that she is really honoring the realism. She's an uncompromising realist, I would argue. It's a sober realism that she has maintained. Does that stand to reason? But it is a striking juxtaposition. You, sir, your question?
Yes, I was struck by when he's having tea with the Mother Superior, it seemed to me there was some kind of shift in his energy of where he took control in a way and felt that energy in him,
Mhm.
taking control a bit of the conversation,
Mhm.
like asking for more tea when she was hoping he was going to take off. Like,
It's such a wonderful scene. There's this tension, is there not, between trying to be vigilant on this equilibrium that they have constructed, in which they have written the script, in which they are the performers, which they are the producers and the directors, and now you have this moment of the extemporaneous, the improvised, and all the energy is who is going to maintain primacy here. And the fact that he does ask for more tea, and the fact that you're right, this energy that is evident there, it inspires him to ask a question. He asks the young girl her name, and she answers Edna, which we learn is one that can be used by either genders. But then her real name is Sarah, and part of the cruelty, if you will, is that she is not only denied her child and nurturing her child, but they've taken her name. They've imposed upon her a name, and they have reduced her to this uniform garment. And the fact that he does indeed begin to interrogate and to ask questions, that's not in the script. And the more that he becomes empowered, that's when Sarah is ready to speak, and the nun at the stove coughs, which is the cue for Sarah to be silent. It's, I think, and that is such a powerfully theatrical scene, and it's written in such economy. It's a very cogent scene, but yet the implications of it, that one scene, I would argue, becomes really representative of, emblematic of the entire perverse equilibrium behind the convent walls. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think.
Other questions? Yes.
I found myself wondering throughout reading it why she chose 1985 for the end of the century long. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I haven't thought about that. I'll do some research on that before next week. Why 1985 in the life of Bill Furlong?
Yeah, I mean, being toward the end of the Magdalene house, was it?
Yes.
Is she suggesting something there as opposed to setting it in the 40s or 50s or 60s?
Right. It would be 1985. It would be 11 years later that the last one will close, and then decades later that the apology will be issued. I'll do some research on that. I'll see what was happening in Ireland in 1985 for next week. I'll be sure to do that. Yeah.
At the very least, in terms of what I think is our felt sense of time, like if she had placed this earlier, in the 40s or the 50s, it would be much easier for we as readers to dismiss that as that's back when things like this could happen. 1985, I mean, that's within my lifetime.
Yes.
And so it means whatever progress we have made as a society, as a church, nevertheless, this was happening in our lifetimes, and we didn't see it.
Right.
I think it implicates us in a certain way.
That's it. Yes. You were brought into as readers, we're brought into this posture whereby we could become complicit as well. Exactly.
And that's her time period,
Yes. Yeah.
She can write out that.
Right. Oh, yes. Keegan is born in 1968. And I was telling some of you earlier, she was at one time in her life too far away from us. She was in New Orleans. She was studying at Loyola. She studied literature and political science, which, when we think about this novel, really becomes, I think, a cornerstone or a very strong foundation from which this novel will emerge. Taught by the Jesuits, and then she goes back to Ireland. She is a member of a large Catholic family in Wexford, Ireland, as well, and lives there today. She has a faculty appointment at Cambridge at Pembroke, teaching writing as well. So yeah, so she's both, teacher, practitioner, as well. Yeah, so I think, John, your response, 1985, yeah, the sense of immediacy. Yeah.
I think it also allows him to have, you know, a fairly successful business. They're doing well, whereas the Irish troubles would have maybe made that less possible.
Right.
I mean, they make the point that there's water for crystal for sale in one of the shops and all that kind of thing. So we're away from all the poverty, or most of the poverty and famine.
The greater poverty, it's the theological poverty. That's the poverty. That's the impoverishment. Yet Bill and Eileen have, you know, a comfortable, modest existence, but the greater poverty is one that has been the misappropriation of Christianity. I don't know if you've seen the film Philomena with Judi Dench, who is, you know, trying to find her son that was forcibly adopted and learns that he has died from AIDS, and that his beloved had him actually buried in the convent cemetery where he would have been born. And when she goes to ask to find his grave and is denied that, she is told by the nun that this denial of seeing her son's grave is a part of her punishment for the act that she committed outside of the sacrament of marriage. Yeah.
I've seen that movie, but were the laundries mentioned at all in that?
She has, Philomena has worked in them.
Oh, she did?
Yeah, she
Okay,
had,
I
yes.
missed that. Okay.
Yeah. 60 Minutes did a very in-depth investigation also into.
Oh, really?
Mhm.
Oh.
I was a little bit surprised that our hero, if you will, was male. If you're taking the fairy tale trope,
Yeah.
you know, we have the male come in to be sort of the savior.
Right.
And that surprised me.
Well, true, but would you not argue that the way that Keegan has written against this actual allegorical representation of the Savior, he doesn't come from outside in, he's in the community itself. And the fact that the heroic act is one that is done so very quietly, and it doesn't have this immediate sense of resolution that the Ordinata Concordia will be restored.
And the thing that was so lovely about some of that in this season is that he reminded me a great deal of Joseph.
Oh, well,
In
interesting.
the silence, in the agreement to things.
Interesting, because when they go to the nativity
Delivered
scene,
good.
the comment has been about how vibrant Joseph's attire is in contrast to the others. Exactly, exactly. And there's that beautiful scene where Sarah looks at the burrow and says how beautiful and brushes the snow from the ear. Yeah, but but it's not heroic in the great Aristotelian sense or the Sophoclean sense of the heroic. It's quiet, it's a part of the understated effect as well. And he doesn't come from outside in to address all of the wrongdoing and then restore the Ordinata Concordia. He's within, which again makes it all the more wonderfully complex, because Bill doesn't have the advantage of entering and addressing the evil and then removing himself in a fairy tale way, going on to the next site. His livelihood, his identity is very much circumscribed within this place, and there's a great deal at stake here as well.
That's
He
just
has
like
to-
St. Joseph.
Yes, he has to live there by this action. Yes.
I was just thinking that you could say that Mrs. Wilson's the hero. I don't know if Bill would have done everything if Mrs. Wilson had
Right.
raised him.
In a very quiet, understated way, would you not argue? yes, she is a very noble, quiet character. What she does is an extremely bold act of resistance. Because by virtue of her harboring the unwed mother and the child, she could possibly incur being ostracized herself. But she's widowed, she has means, and she uses that means selflessly for another. That's a righteous act. She does what is right because she can. And she doesn't worry about what the repercussions will be as well. And she will continue to go to her Protestant services and maintain this lukewarm position that she does. But, it's a wonderful, bold act of resistance. And yes, that's heroic, yes, in a quiet way. But she does it because there's a need and because she can. And it doesn't become, does it? It doesn't become an intellectual or theological exercise. I can do this, therefore maybe I will earn more of God's favor, and I'll work off time, she's Protestant, so she's not worried about working off time in purgatory nonetheless. But nonetheless, it doesn't become an intellectual exercise. It's done immediately because there's a need. So thank you for that. Let's see, your hand and then Maureen.
I think there's some parallels between this and the Native American boarding schools, and they were only closed, I think, around 1962, and I visited one. It's like the Catholic Church seems to have blinders on as to the wider charity.
But at the same time, I think about what Albert Camus writes about in the play. The portrait of the Jesuit is most unfavorable. But it begs the question, how has he become the person that he has? And he also says that somewhere there is an unnamed priest that is attending someone who is dying, whereby that person will not die alone. And that person will never be recorded in the annals of the church. And I think Keegan, very much in her own way, her restraint discourages us from condemning the characters. She is a charitable writer in that, in spite of what we know these individuals are committing, she handles them charitably and asks the question, well, how have they become this? Having not been born this way. Maureen, your hand?
Well, I just wanted to make the comment that because Mrs. Wilson was not a member of the Catholic community, she may have had a little more freedom to not worry about what everybody at church on Sunday was going to think of her for doing what she did. And the other thing I wondered about is you mentioned that the government, the Irish government, apologized. Has the Catholic Church apologized, or the Magdalene sisters, or whoever was complicit in all this? They have. Well, the Pope did visit, did he?
Yes, he did. But I'm reminded of that line from Shakespeare, he receives comfort like cold porridge. So, well, thank you all. The bell tolls, and we'll resume next week. I want to do somewhat of an exegesis with the representation of the Mass there, and what we as readers infer from that. And that's, what we have to also realize is Keegan very much honors our intelligence as readers, and it's through implication and inference that I think she very much respects what we bring to the literary experience. So, see you. Bye-bye.
Next week, we are in the West Wing. We are back in the West Wing next week.
We'll find each other.